Well, yeah. So welcome everyone to the March session of the Transmedia Arts Seminar, hosting Lauren Switzky's talk entitled Playable Theater and Gaming and Aesthetic Control. My name is Hannah Borden, and I am a professor of theater and performance studies at Barnard College, Columbia University, and I co-chair the Transmedia Arts Seminar with my colleague, Professor Magda Romanska, who is based at the Emerson College and who shares the same field with me. Before I welcome our speaker, let me thank the Mahindra Humanities Center and Meta Lab, both at Harvard University, for their co-sponsorship and support of this seminar. Also, let me note how you can participate in the discussion Magda will moderate after the talk, which will take about an hour. So during or after the talk, you can submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you prefer to interact via voice and image, it's possible we have that capacity as well. As you could hear, we are recording the webinar and plan to post it on the Mahindra Humanities Center website. So if you participate in an identifiable way, please be mindful that by doing so, you are authorizing the use of the recording in this way. But if you would like to participate, but anonymously, you can do so under an alias and by turning off your video. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Lauren Switzky, who is an associate professor of English and drama at the University of Toronto. He's the editor of Modern Drama, the most prominent journal in English centering on dramatic literature. His most recent publication is Shakespeare's Things, a collection of essays on the non-human actors in Shakespeare's plays. He has taught and written about video games, among other media, and is a participant in a social sciences and humanities research council-funded project on theater and gaming called Scaling Liveness. So Larry, we are excited, very excited about your talk. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and the Zoom floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Hannah. I want to thank Magda and Hannah for inviting me, Meta Lab for hosting this, Mahindra Humanities Center for hosting the series of events and the seminar series in general, and all of you for joining me this evening. Boy, everybody's disappeared. That's a very funny feeling. I also want to acknowledge that even though we're in a virtual space, I'm joining you from Treaty 13 land in Canada, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And the city I'm broadcasting from, Toronto, is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I do want to say also, I understand how significant and widespread Zoom fatigue is and how important it is to regulate your access to screens during this time. And I'm grateful that you've chosen to spend your time with us. Yet another preamble. I want to say that I've truly enjoyed and benefited from this seminar as an audience member and as an occasion for intellectual gathering and sustenance, and particularly the exploratory, playful, and above all pluralistic attitude towards the transmedia arts that Magda and Hannah have encouraged. It's in that spirit of envisioning an emerging field that I'm going to present my remarks tonight. It's particularly exhilarating as well as challenging, I think, to engage in transmedia arts writing and criticism because the field demands constant interdisciplinary thinking. Let me just ask you, even if a lot of the material from game studies or theater or performance studies is familiar to you, I hope that putting it together this way will generate some fresh questions. I'm going to begin my presentation. Hold on one second for the inevitable tech strangeness. Here we are. My remarks tonight are going to be structured into 3 sections. The first is called Freedom and Control. So let me begin by considering two instances that I hope will establish some coordinates for my discussion. Exhibit A. Last week, I attended a transmedia event called Dream, a co-production of the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Manchester International Festival, an immersive arts collective with the wonderful name of Marshmallow Laser Fest, and the London-based Philharmonia Orchestra. This event, which some of you may have also experienced, which was all over the UK papers and all the arts sections, advertised itself as a convergence of multiple media, most prominently performance and gaming technology. That's in the headline here from the Royal Shakespeare Company website. The claim is literal technologically. The rendering software and the production used to blend real-time motion captured actors, user input, and a responsive soundtrack is Epic Games' Unreal Engine, otherwise used to power online multiplayer games like Fortnite with its 350 million strong player base. Rhetorically, however, the description of Dream as a kind of video game is more metaphorical and I believe a more complex maneuver. The press materials, just going back to that slide for a second, promise that quote unquote Puck acts as a guide and that we're invited to explore the canopy of the trees to the roots, meet the sprites, cobweb, mustard seed, peas blossom, and moth, and take an extraordinary journey into the eye of a cataclysmic storm. In fact, this gets the actual relationship backwards. Paying audiences pilot pinpoints of light. Sorry, here's just an image from the Dream, and here's the light. Paying audiences pilot pinpoints of light that symbolize fireflies to guide actor M. Williams's Puck around the forest, notionally influencing their acrobatic performance as a series of articulation points mapped onto a stone-skinned skeleton. A somewhat disenchanted Sarah Crompton in the theater blog What's on Stage reported frustration at the gap between promised and delivered action. She wrote, "The audience's ability to influence the forest world in the form of fireflies flicking into the forest ceiling and lighting Puck's way is understandably minimal and doesn't add that much. If I'm entering a virtual world, what I want is to be transported. I want to do things I can't, like riding a horse or flying through the sky." In the March 14th edition of the Sunday Times, meanwhile, director Robin McNicholas reframes audience participation in terms of the unusual and direct influence. He claimed in that newspaper, the actors perform and respond to audience interaction and direction, so each performance is unique. But this also seems like an unsatisfying promise for an audience's role in a merger of game and theater, largely because this aim hardly requires a high-ticket tech intersection of medial sensibilities. Actors normally respond to audiences in all but the most clockwork varieties of live theater and subtly adjust their performances to the dynamics of an audience's reactions. My purpose here isn't to be a buzzkill or to poke holes in a publicity machine during a pandemic, but rather to call attention to the rhetoric of video games that surrounds, but does not necessarily describe this production and others. The RSC is invested in positioning games as bearers of audience empowerment and agency against theater's traditional association with forward-facing passivity in a darkened auditorium. During the Q&A for the March 18th performance, Esa-Pekka Salonen, the conductor of the London Philharmonia, claimed that the entire piece was designed to, quote, give more agency to the actors and to the audience as well. In fact, I would argue that Dream does make clever and original structural use of video games, though not in the sense described in the event's publicity materials. Dream is a translation of Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, into the generic terms narrative logic, visual iconography, and highly compressed spatio-temporal parameters of the video game. At a half hour in length, shorn of most of Shakespeare's plot and language, and staged as a series of encounters between Puck and a series of monumental fairies, Dream sieves Shakespeare's play through the dramaturgy of a fantasy action role-playing game. That highly conventionalized genre thrusts a solo protagonist into combat with a series of towering boss enemies in visually rich woodland environments. When I see Puck in consultation with an enormous, grotesque fairy who is not clearly either friend or foe, as in this encounter with Cobweb in Dream, I recall the intricate boss fights in From Software's Soul series of video games, as in this image of the fight with the armor spider in the 4K remake of Demon Souls this year, or perhaps the battle with the Raktagon in Dragon's Quest XI, or any of a long line of creepy spider bosses. To be fair, few of them contain such a stylish echo of Luis Buñuel as Cobweb does in Dream. But in Dream, I contend, video games animate theater not in terms of freeing audiences from the shackles of inert spectatorship, but rather by restructuring a theatrical event within the visual tropes and dramaturgical currency of a computationally generated fictional genre within an industry that financial analysis website MarketWatch estimates to be more profitable globally than films and sports combined. In other words, rather than acting as an agent of liberation, the video game actually serves as a structuring device, lending a specific form and momentum to the meeting between theater and gaming. In the eyes of some reviewers who missed the lovers, the mechanicals in Shakespeare's speeches, it was perhaps in fact too severe and aritiform. Exhibit B. In 2019, video games journalist Alicia Judge announced that Felix Barrett, the founder of UK-based site-sympathetic theater company Punchdrunk, wanted to embark on a new form that he called playable theater. According to Barrett, I'm reading from this excerpt from The Guardian here, that crazy space between theater and games, that crazy space between games and theater, I reckon, is the new frontier. Sorry, I have to move my window in order to read this thing. In the next decade, that'll be the big thing. What happens when you actually have World of Warcraft in the real world? What happens when you have someone leveling up in a theater production? And then he continues a couple of paragraphs down. I'm taking literal game mechanics to enter theater. That's totally what we're doing, asking questions in that space. In the same way as there are 15 different genres of games, we'll soon have 15 different genres of shows. I actually don't think there's a vocabulary for it yet. For a while, immersive theater was bandied about, but whatever this new thing is called, playable shows are the future. Here and elsewhere, Barrett cites his foundational experience with the video game, Capcom's first Resident Evil, a 1996 game that founded the survival horror genre, and that has a player exploring a zombie-filled mansion in which malevolent biowarfare experiments have taken place. It's not difficult to find echoes of the haunted interior design aesthetic of Resident Evil in Punchdrunk's own macabrely decorated and eerily lit hallways and parlors, which audiences donning masks are invited to wander into and through. So here are some Resident Evil interior designs, and here are some Punchdrunk interior designs, just demonstrating that influence. In the Punchdrunk Encyclopedia, Barrett notes that video games are meaningful to him because they offered a kind of gaming agency. He says the first Resident Evil was influential because it offered a world to explore with a rules set for engagement. This is a view that Jim Bending, Punchdrunk's former development lead, somewhat contradicts almost immediately afterwards when he claims that so much of Punchdrunk's work resonates with game design. You create your own world rule set. So the distinction I'm kind of calling attention to is a certain incoherence here, and whether a rule set is provided for you or whether you create one when you go into a Punchdrunk show. Indeed, Punchdrunk has created a number of alternate reality games and even partnered with the gaming console Sony PlayStation in 2011, oops, here it is, to create And Darkness Descended, a transmedia theatrical experience in the vaults in Waterloo, London, that functioned as a live action prequel to the video game Resistance 3. At the launch of And Darkness Descended, Barrett claimed that the audience had become a player in an experience. This is Barrett again. We're delighted to be exploring the role of the audience as player, participant, and potentially character within a project that transcends theater and gaming, in particular the visceral potential for a fusion of these two forms. Punchdrunk Enrichment, the education and outreach arm of the company, articulates a similar vision in the introduction to Punchdrunk materials that they send out to students, which contend that the company, quote unquote, rejects the passive obedience usually expected of audiences. And just to kind of give a bit more evidence for the view that I'm arguing against, in the Guardian article I cited before, Alicia Judge, Embracing Gaming as a Vehicle of Emancipated Spectatorship, sums up the ideological and formal openness that games can bring to theater by insisting on a distinction between what she calls totalitarian media and democratic media. Sorry, I got ahead of myself in my slides. Here's the quote from Alicia Judge. Cinema, books, and traditional theater have cemented plot and structure as the building blocks of a good tale. where stories play out exactly as an author, playwright, or director imagined. But whereas this type of storytelling is totalitarian, subject to the vision of the creator, video games and Punchdrunk's brands of theater are democratic. Audiences build their own experiences from an original vision, filled with personal moments that only they might discover and then share with others. But beyond publicity materials and games journalism, there's far more ambivalence surrounding the question of how much agency an audience really has in a Punchdrunk production. Symptomatically, this discussion invokes video games as emblems of the freedom of choice and movement. In an exchange from 2014 between Punchdrunk bloggers that is frequently cited in criticism of the company and scholarship of the company, two audience members exchanged views about Sleep No More, the company's most internationally famous show that has spawned iterations in London, Boston, New York, and Shanghai. I'll just divulge, by the way, that when I was in grad school, I volunteered as a porter at the Boston iteration of Sleep No More about 30 to 50 times. So even though I'm kind of tearing down some of the rhetoric of Punchdrunk now, I quite enjoy their shows. The author of the That Perilous Stuff blog, for instance, proposes that Sleep No More offers even more choice and control than popular open world video games. This is what they had to say in response to one of Punchdrunk's productions. Control of our location and path is a gift to the audience, especially to those of the Adderall generation. In traditional theater, the director stands behind our seat and virtually holds our head towards the most prescient storyline. Those restraints disappear in the Sleep No More S&M experience, creating more ownership of what we ultimately decide to witness or touch. This democratic element, there's that word again, can frustrate some struggling to find the action, but later can heighten the joy of surprise. Immersive video games like Skyrim, Grand Theft Auto, or Red Dead Redemption have done a good job satisfying our desire to control the environment, but cannot trump the personal experience offered here by Punchdrunk. This is a view that's contested by the blog Behind the White Mask, which contends that nothing an audience can do will significantly influence the intersecting looping narratives that constitute actors' trajectories through the show. Trying to solve Sleep No More like a game, such as completing Hecate's Ring Quest, proves ultimately frustrating, writes this blogger. The audience has no true agency within the show. It is immersive theater, not interactive theater. And even those who have found Hecate's Ring say that it merely unlocks another quest. There's no way to finish Sleep No More. It hooks you, draws you in. You can never truly finish. Scholar Lynn Flaherty, reflecting on the relationship between Sleep No More and gaming, comments that while Sleep No More has elements that are reminiscent of a gaming experience, it is not a game with a clear objective. And Josephine Machon, one of the foremost scholarly interpreters of Punchdrunk, has more recently written that the creative agency of the audience, one of Punchdrunk's recurring concerns and favorite terms, is constrained by the degree of manipulation within productions, especially Punchdrunk's spectacular and celebrated mask performances. Here's what she writes in the Punchdrunk Encyclopedia from 2019. In terms of a live performance experience, creating opportunities for different types and level of agency for any audience, according to the specific objectives and artistic concerns of the work in question, is an overriding aim for Punchdrunk. A basic degree of creative agency and decision-making exists in an audience's control of their own narrative journey and artistic experience within masked Punchdrunk events, despite this being wholly manipulated by Punchdrunk. Levels of imaginative agency exist in the various ways audience members make decisions around which route they wish to forge, which narratives to construct, and which themes to uncover. And forgive me, everyone, for this opening being a bit texty. I promise it gets more visual as we go on. Indeed, in the same text in the Punchdrunk Encyclopedia, Punchdrunk CEO and Director of Enrichment, Peter Higgin, acknowledges that Punchdrunk productions most resemble gaming, that they harness the rule-based structures of games to better control a performance that only provides a sense of agency, rather than anything like what we might kind of call real or significant agency. And here's Peter Higgin. The interaction creates a sense that you're impacting the work, but in its current form, the audience doesn't have the power to change narratives, nor the experiential plot of any show. We don't yet have the resources to facilitate multiple endings contingent on different decisions and choices. It's interesting territory, but for this work to come to fruition, the boundary between audience and performer would need to be blurred much further. I would argue that Punchdrunk does actually harness gaming forms and genres, but less in order to empower or liberate audiences than as a storytelling device. a means of differently exerting aesthetic control over an event than a traditional Aristotelian plot structure. As articulated in the design masterclasses, and I had the pleasure of taking one this last weekend, actually, Punchdrunk's methods are nearly identical to what foundational transmedia theorist Henry Jenkins calls environmental storytelling. As Jenkins argues in a really excellent essay called Game Design as Narrative Architecture, environmental storytelling is a spatial model for conveying narrative that players uncover or activate by traversing a real or virtual landscape, much of which is embedded in a mise-en-scène for audiences or players if you like to uncover. And here's just a brief and I think revealing quote from Jenkins. He says, environmental storytelling creates the preconditions for an immersive narrative experience in at least one of four ways. Spatial stories can evoke pre-existing narrative associations. They can provide a staging ground where narrative events are enacted. They may embed narrative information within the mise-en-scène, or they provide resources for emergent narrative. The author of a film or book has a high degree of control over when and if we receive the specific bits of information, but a game designer can somewhat control the narrative process by distributing the information over the game space. Game designers have developed a variety of kludges, of kind of workarounds, which allow them to prompt players or steer them towards narratively salient spaces. This approach takes story, as Jenkins argues, not as a temporal structure, but as a body of information that is then distributed over to game space in order to disclose character and narrative through exploration and discovery rather than exposition. Although players exert some agency over the order of finding and interpreting this evidence, Jenkins emphasizes that redundant presentation of information and other forms of indirect manipulation can guide participants. Jenkins insists rather that different medial forms contain their own equivalents of environmental narrative, and he adjures game designers to consult theater and film genres, particularly melodrama and expressionism, which rely on what he calls the external projection of internal states that linger in spaces, another quote, transformed by narrative events. In this sense, it would probably be most accurate to trace a co-evolution of theater and video games in the 21st century. Certainly, theater goers who wander through Punchdrunk's immersive worlds, rifling through drawers to find revealing letters and witnessing ghostly repetitions of events. Here's an image from Punchdrunk from Sleep No More, where you can see players doing just this, or audiences probably getting that. I think that confusion of terms is important. Resemble video game players who wander through environmental storytelling environments and games to, say, uncloak the history of the utopian city of Rapture in the first-person shooter BioShock by 2K Games, or unlock the doors of a sprawling family mansion to understand the disappearance of an eccentric family in Giant Sparrow's adventure game, What Remains of Edith Finch. So I just, I'm hoping you can kind of sort of see the continuity between Punchdrunk environments. Here are a few of them, again, right here, and kind of immersive storytelling in games. In all these instances, environmental storytelling is largely a means of structuring, guiding, and controlling this closure of narrative, but it doesn't necessarily make players particularly emancipated or free. We might produce many more and similar claims about video games bring to or confer on theater. And I would admit that video games can serve many roles, structural and symbolic, within different types of theater. You might think about, for instance, plays that take video games as content. One of my favorite is Jennifer Haley's Neighborhood 3 Requisition of Doom. We can think about immersive theater modeled on or containing video game works by Punchdrunk or Blast Theory, or Coney, whose artistic director is a games designer, Remedy Protocol, or Entre Ren Good, or theaters that are more or less, theater games that are more or less video game-like. Best Before, Lush Valley, The Money, New Societies. These are all examples that occur to me. My talk today is largely concerned with addressing the prevailing tension between what I'm calling the rhetorical or ideological role that video games play in other media, in this case, theater specifically, and the dramaturgical function of video games. I'm using these terms somewhat impressionistically, though by rhetorical or ideological, I generally mean an emphasis on the values that video games are thought to bear or confer, whereas dramaturgically, I mean how video games structure an event in time and space. Games and adjacent interactive media are often rhetorically depicted as models for offering moral choice, agency, or freedom for audiences within performance. Dramaturgically, though, video games are often far better at constraining, restricting, or otherwise shaping narrative and agency as a means of establishing aesthetic control with an interactive participatory media. In a recent study I admire called Games, Agency as Art, philosopher C.Tai Nguyen argues that all games, and video games in particular, are solutions to the problem of both how to achieve specific aesthetic effects within artworks that contain, how to achieve specific aesthetic effects within artworks that contain agential gaps, a space for what Nguyen calls agential distance, the participation of an autonomous agent. But given that their constitutive material is the actions of other people, Nguyen insists that game designers have a number of tools at their disposal to finally shape the experiences and actions of players at a distance. Here's a quote from Nguyen, again, that I think really concretizes his position. Game designers have a vast degree of control over the agents that will occupy their created environments, far vaster than the designers of our public infrastructure have. Game designers can simply designate the goals and abilities that can depend on their players to mold themselves to the specified agencies. The game designers obviously do not have complete control over the natures of a player's agency. Many features of personality, motivation, and playstyle are outside their control. But as a matter of degree, game designers' control over the nature of agency is far greater that is than people who design public infrastructure. They can specify the basic motivation. They set the skeleton of an in-game agent. Following Nguyen's sense here, I hope to shift the rhetorical and ideological function of video games to match their dramaturgical affordances as highly manipulated, constrained, and structured experiences, methods of transmedial management rather than vanguards of liberation, that nevertheless do accommodate or accentuate different agencies than other media might. Marketing managers understandably emphasize the excitement, speed, and empowerment of video games to attract audiences who are skeptical of theater as an older and allegedly more linear medium, but who enjoy the responsiveness and apparently more participatory qualities of newer media. Nevertheless, I want to try to understand more precisely how video games can and do work within transmedia ecologies, and indeed to try to think past the binary account of theater and other older media as passive or totalitarian, and video games as active and democratic media. Video game scholar Paul Cheng, for instance, reminds us that audiences of film, theater, and cinema are hardly inert, even if they aren't motorically active in the same way as a player with a controller or an audience member rushing down a hallway. Rather, they participate in what Cheng calls continual psychic interactivity, busily identifying with one character or another, or piecing together signifiers. And I find it very interesting, by the way, that sort of Cheng has to kind of frame interpretation sort of in terms of interactivity in order to rescue it, to reclaim it, because that term is obviously so positively weighed in our own time. Likewise, we might consider the position of Pippin Barr, a video game creator and theorist based at Concordia University in Montreal, who champions what he calls minimal gameplay. Barr is perhaps best known for a series of games he has produced about and sometimes with performance artist Marina Abramovich, in particular his 2011 game representation of Abramovich's exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, The Artist is Present, which at that time he described as a little different and not at all fun. In that game, your avatar spends hours waiting on a line of patrons while you occasionally tap a key to move forward, only perhaps to simulate the experience of sitting opposite a pixelated Marina Abramovich at a table, which, as you can see, is not at all as satisfying as the real thing might be. According to Barr, his games deprioritize and severely delimit traditional gaming agency, activities like running, killing things, and collecting objects or points to optimize strength and score, to free up as much room as possible for a player to have interpretive agency. When a game does very little to stimulate you, when it offers you very little gameplay, according to Barr, you're put into a position where you have to think rather than act, speculate about, query, and perhaps even refuse the terms of a given ludic scenario. And to Barr, that's also an important form of agency. Although I'm going to focus on the place of the video game in the rest of my remarks as primarily a force of aesthetic control and within a transmedia theatrical event, I hope that these remarks will be compelling to many members of a seminar on the transmedia arts. Robert Pratton, who has already been summoned several times in this series of talks to sort of as a muse of transmedia storytelling, understands video games as keys to making and comprehending transmedia experiences. For Pratt and individual open world video games like Fallout 3 and Red Dead Redemption model how to balance authorial control and a player's power to interact. But perhaps more significantly, he counsels transmedia makers to always take into account gaming as an ingredient that infuses the whole structure of a transmedia event. Pratt advises planners of transmedia experiences to consider gaming as one of 4 axes in the planning of any story world, and as the axis that has the most potential to directly motivate participant behavior. Here are his 4 axes with gaming included in them. I take Pratton's claim for the overarching structural importance of gaming, as well as his relative vagueness about the implementation of gaming, as an invitation to offer a more fine-grained account of the operations of video games within transmediation more broadly. To do so, I'm now going to turn to video game criticism itself, which has in fact been far more skeptical about the agency offered within games than theater and many other fields. And from the very beginning of video game scholarship, game designers have reflected on their own operations by constant reference to theater, which is another fact that I find quite interesting. So that leads me to part 2 of my talk: theater, video games, and agency, the buoyancy of influence. Video games have always been associated with questions of agency and action. 2 recent surveys of the field emphasize that games are fundamentally about doing, affecting change or gaining knowledge through action. Oops, I went the wrong way. For instance, Jesper Juhl, in his recent book, Handmade Pixels, says video games fundamentally involve doing something, not just watching or thinking about something, but physically making something happen on a screen or outside a screen, something for which we generally feel responsible. Whereas Nora Wardrop-Fruin, in his recent book with the excellent title, How Pac-Man Eats, says games are about things through play, something I believe we need to talk about more. To tell the history of the evolution of the idea of agency in video games would require a book of its own. As Juhl goes on to point out in his study, there's a historical irony to the recent valorization of player agency as an aesthetic good, since classical aesthetics would have banished games on precisely the same grounds. Whereas Kantian aesthetics, say, insisted our relationship to the work of art should be characterized by contemplation without our concern for utility, games are fundamentally purposeful and goal-oriented, constitutively invested in strategy and achievement. Indeed, one place the field of game studies is often thought to have really begun and taken off was in 1997, with the publication of 2 texts that attempted to reconcile traditional literary aesthetics with the emerging significance of hypertext in video games. One, Cybertext by Espen Aarseth, elides the roles of reader and player to formulate a new kind of nonlinear and active storytelling experience, which Aarseth called ergodic literature. For Aarseth, the player is empowered, risk-taking on the field rather than resting on the sidelines. This is what he says: in ergodic literature, non-trivial effort is required to traverse the text. A conventional reader, however, strongly engaged in the unfolding of a narrative, is powerless. Like a spectator at a soccer game, he may speculate, conjecture, extrapolate, even shout abuse, but he is not a player. So again, kind of the player, the person who sort of is engaged in active tasks, the one who's the performer in some ways, occupies kind of a more heroic role for Aarseth. That same year, Janet Murray also published Hamlet on the Holodeck, which formulated an influential and often contested definition of agency in video games, with the contention that agency is the satisfying power to take meaningful action and see the results of our decisions and choices. This is a definition of agency that has launched 1,000 articles. Though Murray finally and controversially claims that the only true agent in a game is the designer who authors procedures in the game, which Murray likens to the choreography that scripts dance steps, and that enable actions to act in various symbolic dramas, another Murray term that she believes underlie most games. Murray's account of agency in games is animated again and again by the shifting allocations of power between playwright, performer, and director in the modern theater. She's constantly referring to theater to make sense of games. Both texts, both Aarseth and Murray, are significant for us in that while claiming to address literary narrative, they continually refer to and borrow from theatrical and performance forms to understand the intricacies and contradictions of agency in games. In that regard, however, Aarseth and Murray relate to a party started by Brenda Laurel, a video game researcher with a background in theater, who published her seminal manual of human-computer interaction, Computers as Theater in 1991. Laurel's vision of interface design uncannily prophesies central concepts and keywords in transmedia art design, asserting that users approach computer interfaces as quote unquote representational worlds, much more like plays in which they are characters than computers on which they run programs, and that interfaces are fundamentally portals to quote unquote imaginary worlds that have a special relationship to reality. Worlds in which we can extend, amplify, and enrich our own capacities to think, feel, and act. Laurel bases her analysis of world creation and the shared agency of computers and their users in Aristotelian dramaturgy as laid out in Aristotle's Poetics. For my purposes today, it's significant that Laurel apprehends Aristotelian dramaturgy, like interface and game design, as at once enabling a set of possible actions, as well as imposing meaningful constraints on those actions. So right from the very beginning of thinking about video games, in other words, the thinking about video game design, Brenda Laurel's thinking about theater and about constraint. Interpreted analogously through Aristotle's Anatomy of Ancient Tragedy, for instance, a program for Brenda Laurel becomes a means of enabling action. She says a program is a set of actions that defines the potential actions that make up human-computer activity and their representations. On the other hand, by piggybacking on the importance of probability in Aristotle's prescription for creating coherent and intelligible representations, Laurel characterizes a program as a constraint system that limits potential agency within a mimetically continuous world. She's constraining how or whether people can introduce new potential into a dramatic interaction is essential in the creation and maintenance of dramatic possibility. Intrinsic constraint should limit not what people do, but what they're likely to think of doing. Laurel, drawing on drama, deduces that what you can do is as important as what you can't do in creating a compelling and interactive imaginary computational world. I focus thus far on the beginnings of video game criticism in the second section, but to pursue the topic of the video game as a mechanism of dramaturgical control, I now want to move ahead of time to a series of concerns about the significance and reality of gaming agency that began to crop up in the early 2010s. During this era, both game makers and game scholars became concerned with the problem of false, misleading, or unsatisfying agency in games, particularly narrative adventure games like The Walking Dead by Telltale Games, part of a transmedia franchise that included a hugely popular series of graphic novels and a TV show. And a diegetic phrase in these games has now become notorious. The Walking Dead video game would occasionally signal players that choices of action and conduct would have substantial consequences, by saying that another character in the game would remember a player's actions. Here's one of these instances. Clementine will remember that, and conduct would have substantial that choices of action and conduct would have substantial consequences and would send the player down one of numerous and irreconcilable forking paths. In fact, these choices and their alleged consequences created small and only temporary digressions from minor modifications of text within a linear and preset narrative. Here's a diagram, a kind of flow chart of what the effects of a given choice within The Walking Dead video game were. As you can sort of see, there's a temporary digression, which then comes back together again with a linear preset narrative. As games journalist Matthew Bird reflected in 2018, The Walking Dead was perhaps most significant for the desire it instilled for non-episodic linear storytelling than it was for its ability to imagine how to fulfill that desire. Perhaps the apotheosis of this trend, of this gaming moment, where meaningful choice in games, meaningful agency in games was being questioned, was a game called The Stanley Parable by Galactic Cafe in 2013, an exploration game played in an abandoned office facility in which a narrator tries to guide you, a player, to make certain choices that will further the story he's trying to tell about servitude and liberation. The game itself serves as a kind of allegory of game design, with the narrator as a narcissistic designer and the player as a rebellious spirit of free will. Here's an image of a very famous early choice in that game, in which the player is encouraged to surrender agency to story by going left. Although, of course, you're always allowed to go right. In response, the player is invited and even encouraged to rebel, thereby unlocking other choices that are equally scripted and predetermined. And the narrator entices or threatens the player to comply, punishes the player from non-compliance, or sometimes simply resets the game. In an essay about the Stanley Parable, the game's creator, Davey Wreden, has praised Joel Goodwin writes that the binary choices on offer don't allow for any expression of free will because the choice system on offer isn't a vehicle for meaningful performances of free will. The players aren't making real decisions because no player will use this particular structure as a way to express themselves, to demonstrate their ability to choose. Instead, players are invited to find agency through partial compliance in someone else's manipulated structure. When the player and designer fight one another, a poor experience is the result. But if players accept a certain level of illusion and designers work to make that illusion comfortable, the result is a conversation where both parties have something interesting to say. So in other words, even this game, kind of about free will and rebellion, doesn't actually permit anything like meaningful rebellion, according to this commentator. Instead, kind of the most meaningful choice you can make is figure out how to accommodate your expressiveness within a prescripted series of controls. In video game criticism circles, in the mid-2010s, crises about agency, which recognized that interaction was not inherently or automatically agential, generated resonant discussions about the dramaturgy of choice and actions in games that continue today. We might say that much of this writing responds to the same problem that Slavoj Žižek once posed in relationship to political choice that seems emancipatory but is in fact impotent. Žižek once said that it is a well-known fact that the close the door button in most elevators is a totally dysfunctional placebo, which is placed there just to give individuals the impression that they are somehow participating, contributing to the speed of the elevator journey. When we push this button, the door closes in exactly the same time as when we just press the floor button, without speeding up the process by pressing also the close the door button. This extreme and clear case of fake participation is, I claim, an appropriate metaphor for the participation of individuals in our postmodern political process. While Žižek's model of a placebo button is not directly transferable between politics and games, the problem game makers and theorists have faced during the past decade is not necessarily how to create more opportunities for agency, but how to shape and embed available mechanics, even just opportunities to push buttons to make them more meaningful. As in the past, this more recent round of scholars and scholarly proposals has reached towards theater to substantiate their ideas. Teresa J. Tannenbaum, for instance, in an essay, again, that I quite like called Being in the Story, Readerly Pleasure, Acting Theory, and Performing a Role, has drawn from method acting to suggest that what looks like false or empty agency in instances like Telltale Games as The Walking Dead, that example I presented earlier, should actually be thought of and structured as moments when one can transform into a role effectively rather than trying to optimize or score or explore an infinity of branching pathways. She coins the term bounded agency to describe the pleasures offered to players cooperating with the supports offered by a game system, in much the same way that an actor finds opportunities for meaningful expression through inflection or gesture rather than the transformation of a world or narrative in a script. Here's what Tannenbaum says. Bounded agency works when the player is performing in sync with the design possibilities of the game, or to put it in theatrical terms, following the script. The result of this shift away from unrestricted agency to bounded agency is that it supports a participatory model of narrative play in which the actions of the player are constrained to a small set of communicatively meaningful choices rather than a large set of meaningless capabilities. Li-Ting Kuei and Alex Mitchell likewise advocate what they call local agency and emotional agency, a focus on the intentions and affective significance of player choices, even if they may have no global effects on a narrative. They go so far as to claim that quick time events in the game, if you play games, you'll be aware of what these mean. They're sort of moments where you have to mash a single key or button during an event. They're, I guess, probably about as close as gaming has literally gotten to Žižek's placebo button. And they're often taken as examples of minimal gameplay. This is an example of them in the Walking Dead franchise. Can actually nourish highly meaningful feelings of agency. They describe emotional agency in games as arising when moment-to-moment choices and responses bearing sentimental value accumulate to form a sense of attachment to characters in a narrative. Again, this is not sort of hugely freedom-based narrative. This is consenting to kind of the constraints in a video game and finding expressive agency within those constraints. And according to Kuei and Mitchell, a motorically constrained action can be emotionally and intellectually capacious. The adrenaline rush and agency within a quick time event can nurture identification with a character, and commitment to narrative, as long as the intention and outcome of that bounded agency is deliberately prepared and sculpted. Far from promising or pursuing emancipated activity, in other words, much thinking about video game design in recent years has been concerned with the shortcomings of some forms of agency and how to effectively control and contour the player agency that does exist to produce meaning, emotion, and identification. In a very recent essay called revealingly titled, "You Can't Make Video Games About Much," Noah Wardrop-Fruin calls our attention to how what a video game means or communicates relies on the operational logics that enable play, and that these logics are at present enormously limited. That's why I had this slide in here. They can include pattern matching, resource management, collision detection, or movement and physics logics. Wardrop-Fruin urges us to apply these few underlying logics consistently and creatively to create meaningful experiences of play and reflection that corresponds to the thematic and metaphoric goals of any ludic enterprise. He says, if we want to create games that are played about something, we have no choice but to grapple with the limited number of well-developed operational logics. It is this constraint that limits the set of playable models we can construct, and thereby limits the set of things we can meaningfully make things about. This is not a sort of tragic conclusion for Wardrop-Fruin, though. It merely means that we have to embrace a kind of realism about the kind of agency we can exert within games as they currently exist. Throughout all these examples, I want to propose that video games, as designed and theorized, furnish an indispensable toolkit for the dramaturgy of transmedia arts and how they envision and implement participation. If I persuade you of nothing else tonight, in fact, I hope I've at least demonstrated that the fine-grained and often counterintuitive thinking about how to structure logential distance in video game creation is an archive for transmedia inquiries. So for the final segment of my talk, and I want to kind of apply a few of these ideas just briefly, and I want to turn to a couple of examples of transmedia events that join theater and video games to demonstrate how the game functions as an instrument that primarily controls the agency it invites by establishing and sustaining rules, conditioning plausible actions, and assigning value to participatory agencies through computational procedures, as well as temporal and spatial dramaturgies. So let's move on to the last section, which I'm calling video games and the poetics of transmedial agency. My first example is German-based theater company Rimini Protocol's well-known social simulation Best Before, which premiered in 2010 in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Canada. By harnessing the expertise of Vancouver's games industry, Rimini Protocol designed and implemented two simultaneous productions: a theatrical presentation in the foreground and a simulation of a new society called Bestland projected onto the wall. Roughly 200 audience members at each performance participate through gumdrop-shaped avatars. See if here's a picture of the controller they used. You can sort of see little avatars there in the background kind of hopping around. They participate by using an on-screen control, and they participate by using a game controller, and they have the ability to move and make decisions about identity and policy as they proceed along a life course from birth to death. As is usually the case in Rimini Protocol performances, the performers in the theatrical frame of this transmedia event are non-experts. In this case, they occupy professions that either relate to civic guidance, there's a traffic crossing guard, and a politician who represent figures who mold the physical world, or they represent figures in the construction and maintenance of a virtual world, a game tester and an electronic artist. Despite the apparent spatial order of the production space that at first attempts to distinguish between physical and virtual, though, the two medial realms become doubles for each other, as both theater and video games participate in a long-standing and shared project of better understanding a complex reality and one's place in it through simulation. Although audience members undergo a tutorial during the early moments of the performance, in which they're granted various fantastic forms of video game agency through movement mechanics on a screen at the back of the stage, they can make their avatars jump really high into the air and glide across the virtual stage. The dominant metaphor of the theatrical component of the forestage is directing traffic. The first person we meet in the production, in fact, is a crossing guard. And the cast of the production performs a number of movement interludes like the one you see here, in which directing traffic while attempting to accommodate citizen choice, the attempt to exert some control on audience and agents at a distance, in other words, is offered as a ruling metaphor for civil engineering, much as navigating within traffic without a sense of the road ahead is a ruling metaphor for the experience of being a citizen in this production. The video game within the performance also becomes a means of directing traffic by asking audience players to make a series of rapid fire choices when their avatars are young. Do you want to have sex, buy a gun, own a house or a car, be a top politician or a computer programmer, and so forth, without stipulating constraints or consequences? At first, every choice the audience is asked to engage in is mostly a weightless consumer preference for a virtual body in good health. And I want to just show you a clip actually from this production. Just 1 second. This clip is not fantastically high quality, so forgive me if it's a little bit hard to apprehend. I hope you can get something out of it.
Feel a force tugging you around?
Next question. Do you want to break into her stash and smoke your mom's marijuana?
Yeah, just say no. Everyone's back from the hospital, so it might be medicinal.
All right, would you like to use heroin?
Shake up. Move along.
Okay, and so on and so forth. I think that gives you a sense of how sort of game agency, of player agency is presented in this game. What's important here, I think, is that the ramifications of individual choice only become legible over time. When citizens become older within the game, for instance, they discover that their earlier personal and apparently merely preferential decisions have economic and civic consequences as well as health consequences. Hold on 1 second, I just need to find a moment. Just have to wait until the song ends. Oh, sorry. No, we don't. Wrong moment.
Happy birthday, you're 61, just like I am.
New stuff, the flash, back to reality. Your body starts to feel the consequences of the life you led. Everybody who drank, smoked, or used heroin, you go to the hospital for 3 rounds. If the president invested in healthcare before, then you don't lose money. If not, you pay 3 pesos.
Does the president raise taxes?
I'm not sure how clear that was, but the point is that if you decide to smoke heroin or do pot when you're younger, you don't have to miss turns later in the game, and there are further consequences that emerge. So the game engine in Best Before allows player characters to have some force and occasional cosmetic and visual manifestations within the represented world, while also keeping track of those decisions and enforcing ramifications, including illness or good health, wealth or impoverishment, expanding opportunities or imposed restrictions. The playable model that emerges from this aggregate of choices and either intended or unintended consequences is in essence a story world, one largely suffused with an affective environment of regret, uncertainty, and dark humor. I want to argue that this aesthetic, a pervasive atmosphere that doesn't just model the world of civic engagement and speculation, but also comments on it, it was a result of how the video game within the transmedial representation structures participation. I have to go back to my PowerPoint for a second. There we go. One way to consider the aesthetic control exerted by the video game's dramaturgy is to realize how deliberately player agency is structured within Best Before. And again, video game studies can help us to understand how it works. Peter Mauwerter and his colleagues have theorized what they call choice poetics within video games, which seeks to understand how certain general patterns of controlled choice within games tend to generate player experiences and either nurture or alienate various forms of engagement. Video games that contain a number of dead-end options, for instance, that is, decisions that can lead to the game suddenly ending, can create powerful feelings of player autonomy, enabling players to reflect on the overall structure of a game and how to avoid undesirable consequences, but they tend not to allow for absorption or identification with characters or narrative events. So in other words, kind of the choice of a dead-end option as a choice idiom, according to the system, to this kind of video game theorization or criticism, leads to feelings of autonomy, kind of sort of control or thought feeling about the game as a structure, but sort of prohibits other kinds of game involvement. Best Before, which allows events to unfold deliberately over 2 hours, structures player agency largely in terms of blind choices, that is, choices in which a player doesn't have enough information to form expectations about outcomes, and delayed effects, that is, choices that have more or less identical short-term outcomes, but that diverge significantly in their long-term consequences. As Mauwerter and his colleagues note, these choice idioms, these particular choice idioms of blind choice and delayed effect, can be frustrating, but can also produce poignant thematic reverberations. Disorientation in the case of blind choices and regret in the case of delayed effects. As they point out, regret only exists in the case of an unchosen alternative that would have resulted in a different outcome. And that's an emotion that occurs in choice-based media with branching options like video games more commonly than in linear narratives. In other words, by leveraging the affordances of video games and exerting careful aesthetic control over agency, Remedy Protocol allows for a poignant and textured aesthetic effect within a transmedia environment. A melancholy reflection on the impossibility of perfect knowledge, fused with a nervous celebration of the excitement of choice, even when choices can cause injury to oneself and others. And in closing, I'd like to consider just one other and much more recent transmedial event that took place this past October. This is Canadian-born playwright Celine Song's production of Anton Chekhov's 1986 play The Seagull, which is multiply mediated within the life simulation video game The Sims 4 and the live streaming video service Twitch. This nearly 6-hour production, conducted over 2 nights, has been hailed as one of the great achievements of theater in the age of Zoom, and also as a model of particularly successful participatory theater. I suspect that one reason for the celebration of this piece is that it answered the needs of artists and theater goers during the COVID emergency. Like most long durational theater, as scholar Jonathan Kalbus pointed out, The Seagull on Sims 4 delivered an alternative experience of time, neither the long and empty pandemic days, nor time parceled into the microdoses of social media, though it contains representations of both, but something in between. In perhaps the most substantial commentary yet written on the production, critic Helen Shaw praises The Seagull on The Sims 4 as quote unquote enveloping her in a way that other interactive and virtually immersive shows do not. Shaw especially acclaims the casting session that begins the production, as Song uses the Sims 4 character creation module to assemble the actors who will perform the play. She says Song's extended casting period was the deepest investment of experience yet in remote theater. That hour thrummed like a theatrical probability engine. Again, notice how kind of the language of freedom, of emancipation is kind of creeping in here. Each proposed haircut or aspiration opened up a multiverse of seagulls. At first, she showed us a Constantine with a confident stride, and the play shifted to accommodate it. Maybe Kostya's writing is actually wonderful, I thought. Then swiftly, she clicked through to a slumpier walk, and a less competent Constantine came into focus. Either version gave you a fascinating seagull. Each changing detail unlocked valid readings of the play. Song spoke casually about how she saw various relationships in the story, tossing us whole lectures worth of insight as she clicked and laughed. We were giddy. I think it's worth watching a few moments to understand why this casting process is so exciting. I want to focus in just for a moment on Song's casting session for the avatar that would play Masha. So 1 second here.
Ooh. Yes, we do have to create 2 more. 5, 6, 7. Great. So now we're gonna create Masha.
Super.
We love. Ooh. Maybe we. Okay, let me try a couple. You know what? Maybe I'm feeling her a little bit. I love that she has this like this bob, you know, which I'm gonna probably turn. I'm probably gonna make it, you know, very interesting. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna do Masha. I mean, I feel like she's already sort of set up like Masha, right? Don't you think? She's already like, you know, like in all black, wearing all black. Ooh, look at this. I think we are feeling her. I was thinking about a different like black outfit when I was thinking about this, but I think that this randomized just like found something that's kind of better. Okay, actually, let me see a couple other ones. Which of these feel right? Does it just sort of also look like it is like Russian or something? This is Simlese, which is like a Sim language. Wow. What are we feeling? What are we feeling about it being this clown or this interesting, like very like book jacket kind of thing, and or this cute rabbit? Yeah, there's definitely tall black boots. Yes, I hear you.
It's actually quite fun and compelling to watch this. As you might guess, what I find fascinating in this instance is how the procedural constraints of the gaming system enable theatrical play, directing and empowering the apparently free play of agency by channeling it into certain categories. In the case of Masha, as with so many other figures in these preliminary casting sessions, Song accepts a default figure as a virtual doll onto whom she then maps various desires. In many cases, desires that are already suggested and fulfilled by the categories for expression that are provided by the rules set in The Sims 4. As Borja Fruin suggests in his book, How Pac-Man Eats, The Sims accommodates the kind of open form ensemble storytelling that both Chekhov and Song favor because the underlying structure of the game is based on a numerical simulation built primarily on resource logics, or put differently, the kind of mechanics that underlie the game act as a dramaturgical control that has much in common with Chekhovian psychology. These logics cause the Sims characters to seek each other out, to build up a social fulfillment resource, or will send them away in despair, crying in their room, instigating fights, or working through the night in an incomplete novel when those resources are low. Moments of unscripted but recognizably Chekhovian storytelling result from a serendipitous fit between the gaming model and the agency Song wants to exert, as she creates moments that seem to fit within the story world of the seagull almost by chance. And to conclude, I just want to look at one more moment when Song's desire to use The Sims 4 to corral characters into situations that resemble but don't precisely duplicate the seagull uncannily react the relationships in the play. This is where she's trying to get a couple of characters to have sex.
Tomorrow night. Because otherwise they're going to have a baby too quickly. I think maybe they should just, how do you feel about a little bit of, wow. Yeah, Wufu and Constantine's bed. Let's do it. Let's do it. It's gonna be, also it's a single bed. How do you, okay. Let's see the thing that they're gonna do. Shut up. We're not doing this now. Somewhere else. They're trying to have sex. See. Wow. We're gonna do it. We're gonna watch Trigorin and Nina have sex right now. It's gonna work. She's gonna say yes. Let's see. Oh. I was not right. So he just started playing. I also love that. I also love that like Trigorin and like Nina like almost has sex. Didn't work out. Wow, look at this. Let's try it. Let's have her. Let's see if she would have sex with him. See, they're very excited. Rika's gonna go and have sex in this room. Oh my lord, we're gonna get our cat out of the room. Oh, this is brutal. Oh my lord. Oh my lord. You kick Arkadna out of the room? That's insane. Oh, that's so cruel. Arkadna, you're gonna have to go do something else. This is so sad. Look at this. Oh my god, guys. This is so extreme. I didn't intend to kick Arkadna out of her literal bed for them to have sex. So just so you know, this is what Ubu looks like in Sims. It's quite, you know, family friendly. Let's see if Tunis is finished sleeping. He's still sleeping. Oh wow, look at that. Guys, it was incredible. I think that is what happens when the sex was spectacular. Irina, oh, but look at this, guys. Irina is feeling pretty confident, despite having been absolutely. Look at this. What's happening? What are you saying to her? Oh my gosh, she's being mean to Masha, which literally happens in the second act. I was like, I'm gonna have to skip that. Irina literally mocks Masha for being ugly in the top of Act 2, that I was just gonna skip through. But it turns out that's exactly what they're gonna do. She did it without even me prompting her. And meanwhile, after getting kicked out of bed for her lover to have sex with Nina, who is like a younger actress, she's gonna feeling confident, and she goes and she yells at Masha. It's like she already knows what the play's about.
I'd be curious to hear whether you find sort of satisfactions or dissatisfactions in this moment. I'll say that in closing, what I find in the surprise in Song's voice and face is the pleasure of a creator experimenting with an instrument at once recalcitrant and pliable, and finding the agency she wants is suddenly accommodated by and even amplified by a control structure. I think we're only beginning, this is my final thought, to understand the transmedia arts and their ludic capabilities. And I hope that we can discuss how video games, what they can and cannot do, what they can and not make us do, how they create and disappoint meeting, form part of this composite art form. That concludes my formal remarks. Thanks very much for listening. I look forward to discussing anything that interests you now, whether it's related to my talk or not, to your experience with video games or immersive theater or Chekhov or heroin or whatever.
And thank you so much, Larry. We appreciate very much this great talk. Made me think about a lot of things. Yeah, the manipulation that Celine Song did reminds me of Cantor manipulating his actors on stage. Yeah, you know, J-Shape filming his actors and also kind of directing them as it happens. So this seems to be the kind of a next step in the process of having a director on stage, or director, you know, making work as it happens on stage in a kind of an improvisational manner. So that's, you know, that's kind of a line between structured, you know, totalitarian structured performance and a kind of a playful performance, which renews itself and, you know, and makes it happen in the moment. Yeah. Also, you know, it really made me think about your thesis of trying to disturb this dichotomy between games and theater. The foundation of this dichotomy is the assumption, which I actually made the assumption in my first talk, that games are goal-oriented and drama is not. But perhaps I was wrong on this, because it's not necessary that that games are not object-oriented, because they are, but that theater, even, you know, particularly classical dramaturgy, Aristotelian dramaturgy, is actually goal-oriented. Yeah, the objective is to have a cathartic release at the end. And the way that structure functions is to get us to the point, you know, if you cry at the end of the tragedy with the tragic hero over his flaws. And so in some ways, perhaps we should, from kind of form the assumption from the very start that theater is a form of game, and that it has a very well defined objective. In purely Aristotelian terms, that objective would be catharsis, but it would also be in some ways, figuring out what is that philosophical thought at the end of the experience. Yeah, the hubris makes us, brings out the destruction. The excessive jealousy brings up the destruction, which we have in an Oedipus and in Othello, respectively. And so, in some ways, figuring out that that thought is the objective of the game that is called theater, which brings to mind once again the relationship between philosophy, theater, and games, which is a kind of very interesting way of thinking about it. That in some ways, the drama became a kind of a game-like expression of philosophy. Yeah. A lot of very interesting thoughts today. Let me start by thanking you for this great talk, and then let's open it up to questions. Folks can put their questions in the Q&A on the bottom, and we already have a first question from Miranda McLean. Miranda asks, there are playwrights who build in audience choice sections or alternate ending. You can still impact the work without taking away the artistic integrity of plain live theater. Doesn't this immersive experience just complicate the basic idea? And it's a great question. Yeah, we have, remember, Nora's Dollhouse, there were two endings. There are two existing endings that we have. Yeah. Nora leaves, Nora stays, comes back. Carol Churchill, Love and Information. You can arrange the scenes any way you want. How is this kind of already a pre-existing way, particularly in post-dramatic theater, affect the definition of choice?
Right. I mean, I guess I would sort of say that, those choices are kind of more or less meaningful, sort of based on the structure that they've been built into, right? I mean, it's not that I'm kind of contesting that there isn't any choice or any agency whatsoever within theater, right? I'm more kind of contesting a certain vision that kind of equates games with kind of unfettered freedom, and sort of that claims that when you bring a game into a theater, somehow that's what you're granting the theatrical event. I mean, I think that this sort of is more about, kind of how certain constraint structures kind of make choices kind of more meaningful or valuable to us. And about kind of wanting to bring that kind of realization, as well as the very careful thinking about that in video game studies, to benefit other fields like theater. I mean, I think that there are a lot of artists who realize this intuitively. I guess part of my feeling is that kind of, I find a lot of value and meaning in some of these debates and some of these kind of finely honed distinctions that are made in video game studies. And I'm not entirely certain that sort of criticism has infiltrated the other arts very much. So, I mean, I guess, to some extent, this is sort of a sharing of things that I've read that I find kind of meaningful or supple or suggestive. Not all of them equally, and maybe, but I do think as, people who are thinking of making transmedia events or interpreting them, all of this extremely kind of intricate thinking about agency in video games can really kind of help us. It can really be kind of like a reservoir and an archive for us. I'm not sure if that helps.
No, I mean, this is, it's important to point out.
Have I lost you? You've gone all funny on my screen.
Can you see me?
Yeah.
It's important to point out for our audiences that what we when the transmedia is an emerging field, and building this interdisciplinary vocabulary is not easy to do, because the experience of audience and the experience of scholars is very different, because each field is rooted in the in the historical context that the other people from the other field are not necessarily always aware of. And so what you're pointing out, the potential application of the vocabulary from game theory into analyzing the contemporary modern theater, immersive, interactive, however you want to call it, device theater, pliable theater, that it can help us kind of figure out, because in some ways the pre-existing vocabulary is quite limited and does not necessarily help us understand the full mechanics of what's going on in that kind of interactive experiences that are both live and perhaps online. So this is quite complex issue. We have another question. Math is raising hand. Math, do you want to jump in? Matthew, we cannot hear you. Matt, we cannot hear you.
Let's try. Let's see.
Now it's
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I've got 2 layers of mute. Apologies. And so I was just sort of emitting my gratitude for the talk, Larry, which was really rich, lots of resources to follow up on. Really thoroughly enjoyed it and was inspired as well. I'm thinking about sort of riffing off of Magda's response to this last question. I'm thinking about some of the affective dimensions of game and the experience of video games, particularly for watchers. I'm thinking of streaming and esports and how often the expression of skill, whatever the choice environment might be for a given player, the expression of skillful navigation or use of those affordances is something that audiences pay real money to participate in and take part in. And I'm curious where you think that, the interesting kind of question of the sort of ancient ritual aspects of game and theater, the ludic and the performative, how they play out in this context of transmedia as well. What's the dimension of, the effective response to skill, or maybe other aspects of streaming that might have occurred to you as you're thinking about the munging of gaming and theater?
Munging is a great word. Right. Kind of like the affect of the spectator. And it is, there's a huge esports stadium that they've just proposed for Toronto, which looks like kind of like a giant, kind of like sort of a version of the Sydney Opera House. It's exciting, all sorts of comments. But clearly this is a huge industry, and clearly people are having, a very serious kind of engagement with this form of games. I would say, that it is, very compatible with kind of sports. I think, I do think that kind of, I do think that there are various kinds of forms of sort of aesthetic appreciation that appeal to it the same way that kind of, that sort of formal beauty in sports is often discussed. It's hard for me to kind of think about how choice plays into it. Although I guess that there is kind of a lot of choice about, or agency, and sort of in which player kind of provides the most satisfaction for you as a watcher. God, I just had a thing I wanted to talk about, and it's just flown in my mind, because this is a really, it's a rich and fascinating question. I think that the bit that I sort of want to seize on a bit more is sort of this question of gaming and affect. And kind of, again, because gaming is sort of so central to the transmedia events, like I'm not really sure how we describe affect within transmedia, within a transmedia environment. It's like, I'm not sure if we describe it as shifting or the kind of as continuous between kind of platforms in the transmedia event. One thing that I'll sort of say that I find kind of interesting from kind of the cutting edge of gaming within affect is sort of the desire to reach beyond fun, or as sort of like, the dominant affect in gaming. And I think that also kind of applies to a lot of transmedia theorization, where like, you always sort of want players, or engagers, I don't know what word we use, audiences of transmedia events. You want them to kind of, experience flow. You want them to experience, you want them to be immersed. You want them to be absorbed, right? This is the kind of vocabulary kind of around affective experience in transmedia. And this is also kind of an affective dominant in games for the most part. However, I kind of find that kind of experiments in breaking that affective dominant in games probably can also inform transmedia kind of based discussions. I think about the game designer Sam Barlow, for instance, who's done some really interesting stuff. And Sam Barlow actually at a certain point in his career decided to go into making horror video games. And he said the reason he chose to do that is because it's one of the places we can go into making commercial games without having to worry about them being fun all the time. That he wanted to explore the possibility of other affects within video games. So I guess, that's sort of, I guess, what I think about. I mean, maybe the way that this comes around to your point is that, like, that there are probably kind of like a whole number of sort of unmapped affective experiences that the spectator to the player, kind of has. I mean, like, that maybe, kind of, also can be somehow theorized through theater. I mean, there's something about the cousinship, the kinship between theater and video game that I'm fascinated in. So, like, maybe there's sort of something akin to kind of like, to sort of, tragic, to sort of like, to sort of tragic catharsis when you kind of watch like sort of like, a bad gamer or kind of a gamer who you like, kind of fail. Again, I'm not sure how much these vocabularies and aesthetics can interanimate each other. But my sense is that this would be something worth talking about, something worth thinking about.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, the tragic hero, the Hamarsha, being a form of a glitch, yeah, as well.
Yeah.
It's a kind of an avatar with a glitch, so to speak. We have another question from Jared Strange. Jared asks, I am curious about where tabletop role-playing games might fit into this conversation, if at all. On the one hand, they seem to offer the democratic engagement some of these pieces aim for. On the other hand, however, they are typically semi-private, bearing actual play programming, and their mise-en-scène conventions are obviously quite different. In a way, they sort of analog video games. What might they offer to this work?
I don't know if I can sort of speak about tabletop games in general because I don't know about them quite as much. Although, I think that they're, I guess, I am fascinated sort of, you'll sort of see, that I'm really invested in this moment, right? Like, kind of, the moment of games criticism kind of formulating its various, its various priorities and its various kinds of, I don't know, kind of research projects, just research agendas. I mean, I do think that I do think that tabletop games can also be extraordinarily interesting and valuable kind of moments to analyze agencies. I guess I'm kind of thinking about like sort of certain games that restrict agency or that kind of trouble agency kind of in order to kind of get you to sort of think about agency in kind of more ordinary circumstances. There's a game that very often comes up in discussions of critical gaming called Train. And it's a game kind of like, where you start by kind of wanting to optimize. I wish I could remember who made it because it's such a famous example. The name is slipping my head. Where I'm kind of like, where you're loading train cars. And you kind of like, what you're doing is kind of like, you're trying to kind of optimize like how many people can get into the train car. And then like suddenly like, there's a story context that emerges where the trains are going to Auschwitz. And sort of like suddenly you're kind of made to kind of reconsider your relationship to kind of gaming agency, to goals, to player optimization, to even kind of participating in the game, without being sort of fully informed of its context. So again, like my sense is that the tabletop games can be like kind of incredibly powerful devices for kind of thinking about the relationship between kind of control and agency. Like, in that particular, I mean, Train is sort of like almost like a Milgram experiment example, where you sort of start doing something and then you kind of realize the fuller context for it. And then you sort of start questioning sort of other contexts in which you perform actions that you kind of don't think about very much. I mean, I do think that we're in a really, really rich moment for thinking about kind of game structures in general, right? Like, for hundreds of years of philosophy, the emphasis was on play, right? Kind of rather than about, Brenda Romero, thanks, Matt. The emphasis was on play rather than on game, right? Kind of like, on you know, on the activity, you know, the liberating activity, rather than kind of like the structures in which that activity took place, you know, that kind of either enabled or disabled that activity. And so, like, you know, I suppose, you know, to some extent, like, you know, I'm very happy about that switch, because it kind of brings in sort of, you know, my beloved topics of freedom and control, you know, more to the fore. I think they were always operative. I think when one is playing, there's always some game that's being operative. I think now we're admitting it and we're thinking about it.
So, all right. It looks like we don't have any more questions. So I wanted to thank you, Larry, again for this great and informative and very thought-provoking talk. I also wanted to thank again MetaLab for hosting us, and Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard for co-sponsoring the seminar series. Invite everyone for our April seminar. So check it out. They are posted always on MetaLab website and on the Mahindra Humanities Center website. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.